Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome this afternoon. If you don't know who our guest is today, you're in the wrong room. I'm going to be very short, just to say it really is a great honour for Ibec and the Irish business community to have Taoiseach come to address us today. There's so many issues at play right now. It truly is historical moments, but it's not even just the international phenomenon. It is the point of where our economy is at as well. And as you know, in Ibec, we've been certainly seized by those trends, and they're reflected in our campaigns. But I suppose the main one is this model of substance. And that issue about where the Irish economy finds itself now, but the scale of the business footprint here is actually a global phenomenon. And we're very seized by that as a generation, because the choices we make right now will change the course of generations to come, because we've had a lot of opportunity. And so while there are many things that worry us, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we've got great substance, not alone in our business community, but I think without being overly fawning in this, I think we're also got a government of substance in these times as well. I think that is reflective when you look around the world about the stability that our society has. And so that's in no small part to Taoiseach and his colleagues, but a wider society. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Taoiseach, who will address us for about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll take some questions and answers. Taoiseach does have a hard stop at 1:45, and so we'll finish at that point. Thank you very much. Taoiseach, over to you.
So last year, notwithstanding the criticisms of our fiscal stance and fiscal policy, we ran a budget surplus for the first time since 2007. And we plan to run a budget surplus again this year, provided Brexit does not blow us off course. But if it does, we will have the capacity to run a deficit for a couple of years. And that would be the right thing to do, in fact. 10 years ago, we had very few choices. We faced a monumental economic crisis, and government had to slash spending on public services and infrastructure, raise taxes, cut back on public sector pay, pensions and welfare. Even in the least optimistic scenarios put forward by the central bank, for example, in recent weeks, that won't happen this time, because the public finances are in order. The automatic stabilisers will kick in. And while it certainly won't be easy, we're confident that we won't have to return to austerity policies, even in the event of a hard Brexit with no deal. We'll be able to, if anything, stimulate the economy in order to buttress us from the effect of a hard Brexit. So whatever happens, we want to do what any government wants to do and any politician wants to do, which is to raise living standards in a sustainable way for all our citizens. That means better pay. It means lower income taxes. It means subsidising childcare. It means greater access to healthcare and reducing the cost of medicines. It also means, through auto-enrolment, access to a pension plan for all private sector workers. As you know, 2/3 of private sector workers in Ireland do not have access to a pension plan. Probably not the case for Ibec member companies, but is the case more broadly across the private sector, and that needs to change. And we also want to have more family-friendly working conditions. And I think for the businesses of the future, having a family-friendly workplace will be to your advantage in terms of recruitment and retention, rather than being just a cost. In terms of income tax, you'll know that I put forward the proposal last year that over the next 4 to 5 budgets, we increase the threshold at which people pay the highest rate of income tax to 50,000 for a single person and 100,000 for a double income couple. That's come in for some criticism, but it's a policy that I stand over, and I think it's perhaps worth explaining how that would work. At the moment, because of rising employment, the fact that there are more people are working longer hours and they're earning more, just by doing nothing, about an extra 1.2 billion comes into the government every year in income tax receipts. The proposal that we're making is to give about half of that back, about 500 or 600 million a year in income tax relief, to raise that threshold at which people pay the higher rate of income tax. And that still leaves 600 million to invest in public services and public infrastructure. And we think that's fair. It's a policy that will benefit the many, not the few. About 900,000 taxpayers will benefit from it. And what's more, if we didn't do it, more and more people, as incomes rise, will find themselves paying income tax at the highest tax rate. And we also think it makes economic sense. And you as employers, more so than anyone else, will understand that. Because at the moment, people on pretty modest incomes lose half of it in tax if they get a promotion, if they get a pay rise, if they get an increment, if they do some overtime. And that has to be an enormous disincentive when we're trying to get people to do overtime and work longer hours if you're under pressure to get work done, and is definitely a disincentive when it comes to attracting talent into Ireland, back to Ireland, and jobs to Ireland. And that's something we really want to change. Really trying to match, at least sterling for euro, what's happening in the UK on income tax. We also very strongly believe as a government that our economic growth needs to be balanced and sustainable. And that's very much at the heart of the whole Project Ireland 2040 vision. It's a 10-year investment plan, 116 billion euros to be invested over 10 years, to remove bottlenecks, to modernise our public services, to reduce congestion in our cities, to ensure economic development is brought to all parts of the country, and also to provide the necessary capacity for future growth. And I know sometimes when people hear Project Ireland 2040, they think, here we go again, another politician promising something in 2040. But it's not that. This is a plan that's already underway. It's being implemented. Our capital budget for this year is 7.3 billion euros. That's up 1.5 billion euros on last year, a 25% increase in 1 year. And that's being invested all over the country, whether it's new hospitals. You're hearing a lot about one of them at the moment. There are actually 3 new hospitals under construction at the moment. The new National Rehab Hospital in Dunleary, the new Forensic Mental Health Hospital to replace Dundrum in the North County, and of course the National Children's Hospital. New schools being built pretty much all over the country at the moment. New roads. We'll have the pleasure in a few weeks' time of travelling to Sligo to turn the sod on the N4, a really important road project connecting the northwest to the motorway network and helping us to meet our vision of developing Sligo as a major urban growth centre. Energy projects as well, telecommunications projects, and real investment as well in our cultural and sporting infrastructure. This morning, as you might know, I was in Dublin Airport, which is our gateway to the world, and I was there with Minister Ross to turn the sod on the new North Runway. And that'll future-proof the airport for decades of growth to come into the future. It is a project that has been talked about for decades. I remember working on some of the plans for it when I was a member of Fingal County Council back in 2004, 2005. So like the Children's Hospital, the Dublin Airport North Runway is now under construction and will be a reality. And the same thing applies, in my view, to other projects that have been promised for a long time too. And that includes projects like Metro and M20. We'll get these things started and under construction as well. So the shovels are in the ground, diggers are on site, and the future is very much being built all around us. Project Ireland 2040 is also very much about the delivery of additional housing, which is so badly needed in the country for all sorts of reasons. And I firmly believe that everyone has the right to shelter, and also everyone should also be able to aspire to own their own home. And Ireland was unusual in the past in being a country with having a very high level of home ownership. But I actually think that's a good thing. And I want us to get back to the point where home ownership for people in their 20s and early 30s is a reality and not a dream. And I know for you it's a huge issue when it comes to attracting talent, and the cost of rising rents and the cost of housing is impacting on wage demands for businesses as well, impacting on our competitiveness. But I do think we're making some real progress, lifting thousands of families out of homelessness every year, rebuilding the construction sector, and reforming the rental sector by limiting rent increases and improving tenancy rights. And while more progress needs to be made, we are now seeing increased supply at long last. And that's going to be imperative if we are to solve our housing affordability issues and also our homelessness problems. The most recent CSO statistics tell us that 21,450 new homes have become available to live in 2018. And that's a very significant increase on last year. And of those, over 18,000 are new dwellings, new homes and apartments. That doesn't include ghost estates that have been completed, doesn't include vacant homes brought back into use, doesn't include student accommodation. So that 18,000 figure is just new homes and new apartments built last year, more than any year in the past decade. And of those, 4,500 were built by the state. by local authorities and by affordable housing bodies. And that's quite an increase if you think about it, because as recently as 2012, only 9,000 new homes were built in Ireland, and more than half of those were one-off houses built by individual families. So we're on the right track, but evidently there's a lot more to do, and we need to get that up to about 25,000 this year, and hopefully 30 to 35,000 in the years after that. I know that for a lot of people in business, particularly those of you who are exporters, the uncertainty around Brexit is really an enormous difficulty for you to navigate. Brexit isn't our policy. It's a policy of the United Kingdom, but nonetheless it's one that we have to deal with. Our objective is, of course, to avoid the reintroduction of a hard border on the island and all that that might mean. Our objective is to protect the rights and freedoms of Irish and EU citizens, no matter where they may live, north or south of the border. But equally important is our objective to maintain as close as possible a trading relationship with Britain. And that means no tariffs, no red tape, and no customs. That's the outcome that we want, not just from the withdrawal agreement, but from the future relationship. And that is possible so long as they want it too. We're also, of course, determined to protect the integrity of our single market, the EU single market, which is something on which our industrial policy relies. And we cannot allow a situation to develop where in any way our membership of the EU single market is diminished. So we are working to achieve the best solution, but we're also preparing ourselves for the worst. And in recent meetings, both I and my cabinet colleagues have alerted the European Commission that we will seek emergency aid in the event of a no-deal Brexit. The purpose of this, of course, wouldn't be to make sure that everything's okay. That's just not going to be the case. But it is to mitigate the impact on Irish trade, particularly the most vulnerable sectors, agriculture, agri-food, small exporters in particular. We already have approval for rescue and restructuring aid for businesses that are hit by Brexit, and there'll also be restructuring and reorientation loans too, allowing us to go into a company that's affected but viable, rescue it and restructure it to take account of the changes in the rules of trade. We've our legislation, which focuses on the immediate steps needed to protect citizens, the economy, jobs and enterprise, and in crucial sectors. And that legislation, our Brexit bill, will be approved by Cabinet on Tuesday and published on Thursday. And we have signed bilaterally an agreement with the UK to retain the common travel area and everything that flows from that. And that is now signed, and that is important. And while we don't engage in bilateral negotiations, it is understood across Europe that the common travel area is a bilateral arrangement that predates our membership of the European Union and is provided for in both the Treaty of Rome and the withdrawal agreement. So that is now done, and people need to have no concerns about the common travel area and all that flows from it. Ibec, of course, represents our business leaders, and I know that the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation and other departments regularly meet with you to discuss preparations for Brexit, and we're very grateful for your assistance in helping us to promote Brexit awareness among the business sector. Tomorrow we'll host another All-Ireland Brexit Dialogue. It's the only All-Ireland Brexit Forum, and as we come closer to the deadline at the end of March, I think it's important that we deepen our engagement with those on the island who are going to be most affected, both north and south. We're also providing funding and schemes and advice to ensure that businesses are better prepared for Brexit. Life for Irish business won't be the same, but we will provide as much assistance to business as we can. And that includes the €300 million Brexit loan scheme and a longer-term €300 million future growth loan scheme. And if the UK becomes a third country under Brexit, whether it's now or in 2 years' time, I know that business could be very heavily impacted by having to pay VAT and duty at the point of import. So having listened to the views of Ibec and having read your correspondence, the government is introducing a system of postponed accounting to alleviate the immediate cash flow issues arising from Brexit. That's being included in the legislation which we published on Thursday, so you'll have a chance to see the detail around that, and will allow traders to account for VAT in their bi-monthly VAT return. At the same time, while we'd rather it's not happening, there are some opportunities from Brexit, particularly in the financial services sector. And last year we saw 55 firms investing through the IDA, bringing more than 4,500 jobs with them. Big financial firms like Morgan Stanley, like Bank of America, Merrill Lynch and Barclays are among those who've declared a new or expanded presence in Ireland in the past 12 months, and we'll continue to avail of those opportunities. Brexit is, of course, an enormous political challenge, but I think as a country we have to hold true to our position and hold our nerve and be sure of the support of our European colleagues. While I can't offer the assurance which I'd like to provide, an assurance of certainty, I can assure you that until things are certain, we'll keep fighting for all of you, for Ireland and for Irish business. Even leaving aside Brexit, we live in a volatile, ever-changing world. And part of what we have to do is to plan ahead to assure long-term stability. And a big part of our response to a changing world is going to be Future Jobs Ireland, a new enterprise and economic plan which we intend to launch in the spring. And we'd really welcome the input of your firms and Ibec into that as we draft it. And it's based on our recognition that in the next decades, new technologies like artificial intelligence, like robotics, like automated vehicles, are going to transform the world of work and the world of business. Probably transform them as much in the next few decades as the internet and mobile phones did in the last few. So we need to be ready to benefit from the new jobs, the new wealth, and the new business opportunities which will be created. I think you always have a choice. It's either to embrace change and benefit from it, or become victims of change, and we intend to choose the former. So in the next 12 months, our mission is going to be to protect the future while avoiding overheating and structural imbalances. We'll avoid the mistakes of the past through prudent and balanced investment. And unfortunately, when it comes to Brexit, when it comes to changes in the rules of trade across the world, there is no magic wand that allows us to dispel that uncertainty. However, we have to be prepared for whatever may come. And I know you as business leaders have a crucial role to play in that work if we're to provide prosperity and opportunity for all. And I look forward to that ongoing, continued close partnership between government and business in the years ahead as we work together to bring Ireland forward. Thank you. Yeah, I suppose on tax harmonisation, as I said at the Financial Forum yesterday, I think in many ways what Ireland offers business and potential investors is certainty at a time of enormous uncertainty. And we've had our 12.5% corporation tax rate for decades now, and crucially, it's supported by all of the four major parties in the Dáil. We actually provide a lot of certainty, and I think one of the wisest policy decisions we made during the crisis was not to increase corporation tax, because we've demonstrated that through economic cycles, through boom and bust, through political change. This is a policy which is there and will remain unchanged, and I think people making 30-year investments can then rely on the fact that that's not going to change. But there is an ongoing EU agenda around tax harmonisation and it manifests in so many different forms, whether it's digital tax, whether it's consolidated corporation tax base, you name it. And with the UK gone, it's going to be a little bit harder to resist that, because they were one of the countries that was not enthusiastic about it. So what we have to do as a government and a country, and we're doing it already, is to form alliances with other like-minded countries that are not keen on this either. And that includes the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. But we also need to do another thing as well, and it's equally important, as we need to make sure that nobody can credibly argue that Ireland is some sort of tax haven. And that does mean closing loopholes and cracking down on some of the legal tax avoidance mechanisms that were available in the past. And I think it's going to be quite important in terms of winning the argument against tax harmonisation. We're going to need to demonstrate that Ireland isn't a place that companies use in any way to avoid paying their taxes. So we're going to have to do a bit of both to stay ahead of that, I think. And we're doing that with phasing out the double Irish, getting rid of the stateless corporations, sharing information between tax authorities, and we'll continue to do things like that. On Brexit, like a no-deal scenario is very hard to predict, and it's absolutely the case that the most exposed sectors are agriculture and agri-food, unquestionably, given the high tariffs that could be imposed under WTO rules. But in terms of what we can do in that scenario is a number of different state aid actions, and we've had quite detailed discussions with the Commission on this already. One is around the CMO regulation, which was used to assist the Baltic states when the Baltic countries lost Russia as a market. The European Union was able to intervene and provide aid for producers and for business, and there's other state aid instruments as well. So there's quite a suite of things that we can do to intervene, and the EU is ready to do that. It can't be done preemptively; it can only happen after the disruption. That's the way it works. But this would not be a good outcome. The best outcome, obviously, is to secure a transition period during which none of the rules change, and then to get very busy very quickly negotiating a new economic partnership that doesn't involve tariffs and trade. Tariffs or quotas or regulations. But that still leaves the UK having to square a circle that they haven't squared from day one. This idea that they can have quota-free, tariff-free, frictionless trade with the European Union and go off and do deals with other third countries as well. And they still haven't squared that circle yet. I totally hear what you're saying on the visas and the work permits, and when I met with the American Chamber, that was one of their big issues as well that they raised with us. And I have an official in my department, Mary Claire O'Sullivan, who some of you will know, who's working on that on my behalf to make sure that the various different government departments involved, Justice, Foreign Affairs, Enterprise, are all working together to improve this. Part of it is down to the increase in volume with labour shortages in all sorts of areas of the economy now. There's been a big increase in demand for working visas and work permits, and the fact that we reduced some of the thresholds around agriculture workers and so on obviously meant that there was a big increase in applications, and that slowed things down. Now, you would reasonably argue that, surely you knew that was going to happen, and why didn't you prepare for it? But we did, but it was just more than had been projected. So there's kind of two things we're working on. Obviously, one is reducing the processing times, particularly for the trusted partners, and some of that's down to just more staff and better IT. And the other one that we've committed to look at, and we hope we can do sooner rather than later, is around something called Stamp 3. I'm not an expert in this area, but I understand there are actually quite a lot of people in the country who have a work permit, but their spouse or partner isn't allowed to work, and a lot of them actually have a lot of skills that we could make use of. So the plan is to make a change there to kind of make that automatic, that the spouse can work too, which is logical, and then speed up the processing times. But it is something that I'm aware of, and we're going to try and make some improvements there. On tax, I know I touched on income tax. Like, there are two other areas that both Minister Donoghue and I would like to do something on. We weren't able to do it in the last budget, but it's on our agenda for things that we'd like to do. One is capital gains tax. I know that comes up a lot for business, and I do know the previous experience when Minister McCreevy reduced capital gains tax, I think quite dramatically. I think it was from 40 to 20, and that resulted in more transactions and actually resulted in more revenue. But the way accounting rules now work these days is you can't make that kind of punt anymore, and you have to actually, in framing your budget, project a loss of revenue, even if that loss of revenue doesn't arise. And we looked at kind of reducing it by 1 or 2%. We kind of said just reducing capital gains tax by 1 or 2% isn't going to be a game changer. If you're going to do it, you need to do it like 5 or 10 or something like that. But it's something that's in the mix for future budgets anyway. And the other is around share options. Like, I'll appreciate that a lot of your employees would be well over 50,000 or 100,000, and perhaps we're interested in exploring, certainly with Ibec in business, what sort of mechanisms we could use around share options to enable you to incentivize employees a bit better, so that it's taxed maybe as a capital gain or something like that, rather than income, so long as we put limitations on it, and it isn't perceived as being unfair to people who don't work for employers that can provide share options. On the third level, on sustainable third level funding, I suppose part of what we're doing is asking the business sector to contribute more to the cost of third level education. And in fairness, you're doing that with the increase, the 0.1% increase in employers' PRSI. And while I appreciate employers don't want to pay more PRSI, I do appreciate the fact that there hasn't been huge complaints about that, and the vast majority of employers seem to appreciate that. But this is an investment, not just a tax, and that gives us an extra 50 or 60 million a year, which is a lot. We also found a surplus in the National Training Fund PRSI that's been paid in for years and years, and there's about 300 million euros in that that we're going to use for higher ed as well. And Project Ireland 2040 includes a lot of funds as well for investment in higher ed institutions, and I'm really pleased that the technology universities are now actually happening. We have one in Dublin now. Munster looks like it's coming through, which will be Cork, Kerry, and South East is kind of lagging behind, which is really frustrating because that's the area where I want it to happen the most, because I think that'll be a game changer for the South East. But there have been issues between Waterford and Carlow in making that happen, but government's really behind that. As things stand at the moment, we're really not willing to go down the route of significant increases in third level fees. I understand that may produce a lot of funding for third level, but even leaving aside the politics of it, just seeing in other countries across the water, the US, people graduating with massive debts and then trying to buy a house, and that has impacts as well. It drives up the cost of compensation for employers. Often you end up having to pay a lot more because the graduates you're hiring have to pay down big student debts. And in America in particular, where members of my profession, doctors, graduate with debts of $200,000, that's reflected in higher health insurance costs and health insurance premiums. So we're not enthusiastic of going down that line at the present. On carbon tax, we're still kind of debating where we're going to go on carbon tax. There's no party committee meeting at the moment under the leadership of a member of my party, Hildegard Naughton, and they're kind of veering towards agreeing a carbon price of, I think it's 80 euros per megaton or something by 2030. And the idea then is the carbon tax would rise in a stepwise manner towards that point. And then the question is, what do you do with the revenue? And of course, that assumes that there is revenue. We're assuming there will be substantial revenues from a carbon tax. However, if a carbon tax really works, surely there shouldn't be. If you think about it, if carbon tax really works and people use less petrol, diesel and energy, surely there shouldn't be any revenue from it. In which case it makes the next thing I'm going to say irrelevant. But assuming that there is revenue from it, then there's two thoughts. Either you put it into a carbon fund, which is then used to do all the things we need to be doing, like investing in insulating homes and public buildings, investing in electric vehicle charging points, all those things that we're doing anyway. But if you put the money into that fund, you can maybe do more of it and do more quickly. Or the alternative option, which I tend to prefer, to be honest, which is a dividend system, where you give the money back to the punter. not just the punter, but the businesses, because businesses will pay carbon tax as well. And that way you can maybe genuinely convince people that this isn't another tax grab, that this is actually about changing behaviour over time and changing the way people behave and the way businesses operate if it was given back. Maybe on the business side that might fund a capital gains tax reduction, I don't know. Maybe on the individual side it might fund increases in tax credits and child benefit and so on. But it is a tricky one, and I've studied the politics of this a fair bit. We all saw what happened in France with the carbon tax there, and it became a lightning rod for disaffection around everything. In Australia, it's a huge part of their politics, and they weren't able to make it happen. And they're going in totally the wrong direction now on climate change. And we had a taste of it in Ireland on water. And notwithstanding the mistakes that were made, I think water charges were the right thing to do. And we failed. And there's nothing worse in politics than pursuing the correct policy, failing to deliver it, and becoming really unpopular as a result. It's one thing to be unpopular for actually getting your policies through. It's another thing to be unpopular for failing to implement your policies. That's why we need to think this one through and get it right. And that's why I tend to favour the option of charge and dividend, where you have a carbon tax, but you then give the money back to people in the form of a check in the post, or tax credits, or child benefit increases, or something on those lines. On the capital infrastructure question, I'm a big fan of capital projects and infrastructure, and politicians are never happier with them when they're turning the sod on a new project or cutting the ribbon on a new project. And I really enjoyed my time in transport, tourism, and sports. Whether it was connecting the Lewis lines or Gortyu motorway, all those kind of projects, N11. I'm a real believer in infrastructure and the transformational power of infrastructure. Not just in terms of balanced regional development, but also modernising our public services. As somebody who worked in healthcare, you can just see the astonishing difference as to how well a hospital can tick over efficiently when they've modern infrastructure versus ones that operate from Victorian buildings that were never designed for modern healthcare. And when you go into the new schools, I'm not sure how many of you have been in a primary school or a secondary school built in the last 5 or 10 years. Like, these are amazing educational facilities. What they have in terms of facilities and technology is just remarkable, and gives you great hope for the future in terms of how well educated our young people are going to be. And one of the enormous tragedies of the economic and financial crisis 10 years ago was the extent to which capital spending was slashed. And we're paying for that now. We're paying for it now in terms of the housing crisis and some of the problems we have in health and increasingly congestion in Dublin and Galway and Cork as well. But the alternative would have been to slash pay and salaries and incomes and all those things much more than we did. It was never an easy choice. But I'm confident that won't happen into the future. As I mentioned, even in a no deal, hard Brexit scenario, we're confident, central bank is confident, a lot of the independent economists who looked at us to are confident that we'll be able to continue to sustain the capital budgets and run a small deficit for a few years if we have to do that. Being able to do what you should do in a downturn, which is to stimulate the economy, not cut back on everything. And the increase this year in the capital budget is 25%. It'll keep going up over the next couple of years. There is one real downside in that, though, and it's evident, increasingly evident, which is construction inflation. Needless to say, when you're increasing your capital budgets and when the private sector is as well, you're going to have inflation. So there could be a downside to increasing it faster than we are. Might just end up with greater inflation, and that doesn't give us any more schools. It just gives us more expensive schools. But we think we have that right. On the SMEs, very conscious, obviously, that for a lot of SMEs, and I do a lot of engagement with a lot of the different chambers, and they're very much focused, or asking us to focus a lot on cost competitiveness, on the cost of insurance, on the cost of staff, on the cost of utilities, and we're definitely very much appraised of that. Particularly doing a lot of work around insurance, which I think will pay off. Utilities is harder because so much of that is down to factors outside of our control. And I have to say I'm a big fan of the NBP as well. We're not doing badly on broadband. When the current government, the independent government, came into office just over 3 years ago now, about 50% of premises in the country had access to high-speed broadband. That'll probably be 80% by the end of this year, and that's largely been done through private sector investment by the telcos. But for the 20% who don't have it, it's even more annoying. You feel even more left behind than you were before. And I see broadband as a modern utility like water or electricity, and we need to have it in every home and every business. And when you think about the future, like I was thinking, what does rural Ireland look like in 20 years' time? It's probably a post office in every house, because anything you do in the post office, you'll be able to do on your iPad or on your screen. It is people working for multinationals from home, maybe 3 days working from home, one day going into Apple or whatever. It means healthcare being accessed at home as well. Your home help ringing you up, checking that your elderly relative is okay. But we are now examining the tender and evaluating it, and it is going to be very expensive. And I imagine there'll be controversy around that too.
Thank you very much for taking the time today, and appreciate the breadth of all the things that you discussed. And as I said at the start, substance is the issue. I think we have substance in this society.
Apparently I'm all thin though. Anyway.
Oh yeah, all substance.
You do.
Thanks very much, Taoiseach.